The words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest as I stood in my paint-stained work clothes outside the country club's marble entrance. "Marcus, he's worth more than you'll ever be," Linda said, her voice cutting through the evening air with surgical precision. She adjusted the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, a gift from Richard Blackwood, the real estate mogul whose BMW she'd been climbing into for the past 3 months. The valet held the door open, and she slipped inside without looking back, leaving me standing there like a fool clutching a bouquet of gas station flowers and an anniversary card I'd never get to give her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marcus Thompson, and for 22 years I believed that honest work and genuine love were enough to build a life on. I owned Thompson's Paint and Restoration, a small business in Cedar Falls, Iowa, where I specialized in bringing old buildings back to their former glory. My hands were permanently stained with primer and paint thinner, my truck was older than most college students, and my idea of a fancy dinner was taking Linda to the Olive Garden with a coupon. But I had dreams, big dreams. Dreams of expanding the business, maybe opening a second location, buying Linda the house she deserved with the white picket fence and the garden she always talked about. I worked 14-hour days, 7 days a week, believing that if I just pushed hard enough, sacrificed enough, those dreams would become reality. The country club incident happened on what should have been our 5th wedding anniversary. I'd planned to surprise Linda with dinner at the most expensive restaurant in town, had even bought a new shirt and tie for the occasion. Instead, I found her in the parking lot of the Cedar Falls Country Club, a place I'd only seen from the outside when I was hired to repaint their gazebo 2 summers ago. She was laughing at something Richard had said, her head thrown back in a way that made my stomach clench with recognition. That was how she used to laugh with me, back when my jokes were funny instead of just tired. I approached slowly, the flowers trembling in my grip. When she saw me, her expression shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like disgust. Richard stepped out of the car then, all 6 feet 2 inches of him in a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. His smile was the kind that rich men wear when they're about to crush something small and insignificant. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand like we were old friends, "Linda's told me so much about you. The painter, right?" The way he said it made my profession sound like a hobby, something children do with finger paints and construction paper. I shook his hand anyway, because that's what you do when you're raised to be polite even when your world is crumbling around you. That's when Linda said it, those words that would echo in my head for months afterward. "Marcus, he's worth more than you'll ever be." Not will be, ever be, as if she'd already calculated the full trajectory of my life and found it wanting. They drove away in his BMW, and I stood there watching the taillights disappear into traffic. The flowers ended up in a trash can outside the country club, and I drove home to our small ranch house on Maple Street, the house I'd been so proud to buy when we first got married. That night, it felt like a prison. Linda came home 3 hours later, reeking of expensive cologne and wine. She didn't apologize, she didn't explain, she just walked past me to the bedroom and started packing a suitcase with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd been planning this moment for weeks. 5 years, Marcus," she said without looking at me. 5 years I've waited for you to become someone worth waiting for. Richard showed me what a real man provides for his wife. I wanted to argue, to remind her of the early mornings when I'd bring her coffee in bed before heading out to work, the way I'd hold her when she had nightmares, the plans we'd made together about traveling to Europe someday. Instead, I just stood there watching her fold her dresses, each one a small goodbye. "The papers will be delivered tomorrow," she said, zipping the suitcase closed. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." She left that night, and I didn't see her again for 8 months. The divorce papers arrived the next morning via certified mail, along with a bill from her lawyer that made my eyes water.
I signed them at my kitchen table while drinking coffee that had gone cold hours earlier, each signature feeling like I was signing away more than just a marriage.
The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of 16-hour workdays and take-out dinners eaten alone, while watching old movies on a television that buzzed when the volume got too high. My crew at Thompson's Paint noticed the change in me, the way I threw myself into projects with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Jimmy Rodriguez, my foreman and the closest thing I had to a best friend, finally cornered me one afternoon as I was power washing a century-old brick building downtown. "Boss," he said, having to shout over the sound of the pressure washer, "when's the last time you went home before dark?" I shut off the machine, and the sudden silence felt heavy between us. Home's just a place to sleep, Jimmy. This is where the work gets done. He studied my face with the concern of someone who'd known me since we were both apprentices working for old Pete Kowalski 15
years ago.
Marcus, you're gonna work yourself into the ground. Linda's gone, man. Time to start living again. But living seemed like a luxury I couldn't afford. The business was struggling more than I'd let on to anyone. Competition from the big chain contractors was eating into our profit margins, and several clients had been slow to pay their bills. I'd been dipping into my personal savings to make payroll, telling myself it was temporary, that the next big job would turn everything around. That next big job came in the form of restoring the exterior of the Riverside Theater, a historic venue that had been closed for renovations for 2 years. It was the kind of project that could make Thompson's Paint a household name in Cedar Falls, the kind of work that would prove Linda wrong about my potential. I bid low to ensure we got the contract, too low as it turned out, but my pride wouldn't let me admit that even to myself. The theater project consumed my life for the next 4 months. We stripped away decades of paint and grime, revealing the beautiful original stonework underneath. I personally supervised every aspect of the restoration, staying late into the night to ensure every detail met my standards. The building began to look magnificent, like something out of a fairy tale, and I felt a pride in the work that I hadn't experienced in years. But pride doesn't pay bills. By the time we were putting the finishing touches on the theater, Thompson's Paint was 3 weeks behind on rent, and I'd maxed out 2 credit cards just to keep the lights on. I was sitting in my office at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night, staring at a stack of past due notices, and wondering if I should call Jimmy in the morning to tell him I might not be able to make payroll, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize with a Chicago area code. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another creditor calling to discuss payment arrangements, but something made me pick up. Mr. Thompson. The voice belonged to an older woman, professional but warm. This is Margaret Shaw from Shaw, Whitman and Associates. I'm calling regarding your great-uncle, Arthur Thompson. I had to think for a moment to place the name. Uncle Arthur was my grandfather's brother, a man I'd met maybe 3 times in my entire life at family reunions when I was a child. He was the mysterious relative who'd moved to Chicago in the 1960s, and rarely came back to Iowa except for funerals. I'm afraid I have some sad news, Margaret continued. Mr. Thompson passed away last week. He had a heart attack in his sleep. Very peaceful according to his doctor. I mumbled some appropriate condolences, wondering why a Chicago law firm was calling me about a relative I barely knew. Margaret cleared her throat gently. Mr. Thompson, I'm calling because you're named as the primary beneficiary in your great-uncle's will. He left you his entire estate. The words didn't register at first. I was tired, stressed, and my brain was still focused on the bills scattered across my desk. I'm sorry, what? Your great-uncle Arthur was quite wealthy, Mr. Thompson. He never married, had no children, and apparently felt a strong connection to you despite the distance. He left you everything. The house, the investments, the life insurance policy. The total value is approximately $2,100,000. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered onto the desk. $2 million. I picked up the phone with shaking fingers. Are you sure? Are you sure you have the right Marcus Thompson? Margaret chuckled softly. Marcus James Thompson, born April 15, 1985, in Cedar Falls, Iowa, son of Robert and Patricia Thompson. That's me, I whispered. Then yes, I'm quite sure. Now there are some conditions attached to the inheritance, which I'll need to explain to you in detail. Would it be possible for you to come to Chicago this week? I looked around my office at the past due notices, and the calculator displaying numbers that made my stomach clench, and laughed out loud. It was a sound somewhere between relief and hysteria. Miss Shaw, I'll be there tomorrow. The drive to Chicago felt like traveling to another planet. I'd borrowed money from Jimmy for gas and wore my one good suit, the same one I'd worn to my wedding 5 years earlier. Shaw, Whitman and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming downtown building that made me feel like a country mouse who'd wandered into the big city. Margaret Shaw turned out to be a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Her office was all dark wood and leather-bound books, the kind of place where important decisions were made by important people. Your great-uncle was quite a she said, pouring coffee from an expensive-looking service. He started with nothing, worked his way up from a shoeshine boy to owning a chain of successful hardware stores throughout the Midwest. Very shrewd businessman, but also very private. He never forgot his Iowa roots. She slid a thick folder across her desk. Now about those conditions I mentioned. Arthur was very specific about his wishes. You'll receive the full inheritance, but there's a 12-month waiting period before you can access the funds. My heart, which had been soaring since the phone call, suddenly felt heavy again. 12 months. He wanted to ensure that you wouldn't make any rash decisions with the money. During that year you're required to maintain your current lifestyle and business. No major changes, no telling anyone about the inheritance. He felt it was important for you to prove that you could handle this kind of wealth responsibly. She opened the folder and pointed to a handwritten note clipped to the legal documents. He wrote this for you personally. I recognized the shaky handwriting from birthday cards I'd received as a child.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The note was brief but clear. Marcus, I've watched you from afar and seen the man you've become. Hard-working, honest, loyal to a fault. Don't let this money change who you are. Use it to become who you're meant to be. The year of waiting isn't punishment, it's preparation. Make me proud, nephew. I read the note 3 times before looking up at Margaret. So for the next 12 months I pretend this never happened? Exactly. Continue running your business. Continue living your life as you always have. At the end of the year, the funds will be released to you with no further restrictions. But Marcus, she leaned forward, her expression serious, if you break the conditions of the will, you forfeit the entire inheritance. Arthur wanted to make sure you understood the weight of that responsibility. I drove back to Cedar Falls in a daze, my mind racing with possibilities and fears in equal measure. $2 million was more money than I'd ever dreamed of having, enough to expand Thompson's Paint into a regional powerhouse, enough to buy the house Linda had always wanted, enough to prove that I was worth more than she'd given me credit for, but I couldn't tell anyone. For 12 months I had to keep living like the struggling small business owner I'd been that morning, while sitting on a secret that could change everything. The first few weeks were the hardest. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced that I'd dreamed the whole thing. I kept Margaret Shaw's business card in my wallet, and would pull it out at random moments just to convince myself it was real. The inheritance documents were locked in a safety deposit box at First National Bank, but I found excuses to visit them twice a week, just to hold the papers in my hands and feel the weight of what was coming. My behavior at work became erratic. One day I'd be in a mood so good that Jimmy would joke about me winning the lottery, and the next I'd be snapping at everyone over minor mistakes. I started working even longer hours, partly to keep myself busy and partly because I knew these would be my last months of struggling. I wanted to remember what it felt like to worry about every dollar, to appreciate what I was about to receive. The Riverside Theater project was completed in November, 2 months after my trip to Chicago. The unveiling was a community event, with local politicians and business leaders gathering to celebrate the restoration of one of Cedar Falls' historic landmarks. I stood in the crowd, watching the mayor cut the ribbon, and felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with the money waiting for me. "Beautiful work," said a voice behind me. I turned to see Robert Mitchell, president of the Cedar Falls Chamber of Commerce, extending his hand. "That building was an eyesore for years. You've given it new life." We shook hands and I felt the calluses on his palms that marked him as someone who'd worked with his hands before moving into administration. "Thank you, sir. It was an honor to work on such an important piece of local history. I hope you'll consider bidding on the library renovation project we're putting out for proposals next month," he said. "After seeing what you did here, I think Thompson's Paint should definitely be in the running." The library project was the kind of contract that could sustain my business for 6 months, the kind of opportunity I would have killed for just a year earlier. Now knowing what was coming, it felt almost insignificant. But I smiled and told him I'd be honored to submit a proposal. That night, alone in my kitchen with a microwave dinner growing cold in front of me, I realized something that made my chest tighten with unexpected emotion. I was already changing. The knowledge of the inheritance was making me see my current life as temporary, something to be endured rather than lived. Uncle Arthur's condition about maintaining my lifestyle suddenly made perfect sense. He wanted me to remember what it felt like to struggle, to appreciate the value of honest work and genuine relationships. I thought about Linda then, probably having dinner at some expensive restaurant with Richard, posting photos on social media of champagne flutes and perfectly plated meals. In 8 months I'd have more money than Richard could ever dream of having, but the thought brought me no satisfaction. Money couldn't buy back the 5 years we'd spent together, couldn't erase the memory of her walking away without a second glance. December arrived with an early snowstorm that blanketed Cedar Falls in 3 feet of pristine white. I was at the shop early that morning, starting up the heaters and checking on the equipment, when I heard a car door slam in the parking lot. Through the window, I could see a figure trudging through the snow toward the front entrance. It was Linda. She looked different, thinner somehow, her expensive clothes replaced by a simple wool coat that had seen better days. Her hair, which had always been perfectly styled, hung loose around her shoulders, and there were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. I opened the door before she could knock, and we stood there for a moment in the doorway, the cold air swirling around us like ghosts of our past. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice smaller than I remembered.
Linda.
I stepped aside to let her in, and she brushed the snow from her coat before looking around the shop with what might have been nostalgia. "You've expanded," she observed, noting the new equipment I'd purchased with what little profit the theater project had generated. "Business has been good," I lied, not mentioning the bills that were still piling up or the nights I lay awake wondering if I could keep the doors open another month. She wandered over to the workbench where I'd been mixing paint earlier, running her finger along the edge like she used to do when she'd visit me during our early dating days. "I heard about the theater project. Everyone's talking about how beautiful it looks." "It was good work," I said carefully, unsure where this conversation was heading. Linda turned to face me then, and I could see tears gathering in her eyes. "Marcus, I made a mistake, a huge mistake." The words hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to process. I'd imagined this moment dozens of times over the past 8 months, but now that it was happening, I felt nothing but a strange emptiness. "Richard and it's over," she continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. "It turns out all that wealth I thought he had was mostly borrowed money and creative accounting. The IRS is investigating his business, and the bank has foreclosed on his house. He's broke, Marcus, broke and probably going to prison." I absorbed this information without feeling the satisfaction I'd expected. If anything, I felt sad for her, sad that she'd bet everything on someone else's success only to watch it crumble. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and meant it. "I've been staying with my sister in Des Moines, but that's not working out. I was wondering," she took a shaky breath, "I was wondering if we could try again, if you could forgive me for being so stupid." There it was, the moment I'd dreamed about and dreaded in equal measure. Linda was asking for another chance, and I had the power to give it to her, or walk away forever. In 8 months, I'd be a wealthy man. In 8 months, I could give her everything she'd ever wanted. In 8 months, I could prove that she'd been wrong about my worth. But sitting on that secret felt like poison in my veins. I couldn't tell her about the inheritance, couldn't let her know that everything was about to change. And without that knowledge, was her return genuine, or just another calculated move based on limited options? "Linda," I said carefully, "what's changed? 8 months ago, you told me I'd never be worth anything. What's different now?" She looked down at her hands, and I noticed her wedding ring was gone. I realized that worth isn't about money, that Richard might have had more money, but he didn't have your kindness, your dedication. The words sounded rehearsed, like she'd practiced them in her car before coming in. Maybe they were genuine, maybe they weren't. The terrible thing was, I couldn't tell anymore. "I need time to think," I told her, and watched something die in her eyes. She nodded and headed for the door, pausing with her hand on the handle. "Marcus, I know I hurt you. I know I don't deserve another chance, but I love you. I never stopped loving you, even when I was too proud and too stupid to see what I had." After she left, I sat alone in my shop for a long time, listening to the heaters hum and the wind rattle the windows. The money in that safety deposit box had become both a blessing and a curse, a secret that was changing me in ways Uncle Arthur probably never intended. 4 months remained until I could claim my inheritance. 4 months of pretending to be someone I was no longer sure I recognized. 4 months of wondering if Linda's return was about love or desperation, and whether I'd ever be able to trust my own judgment about people's motives again. Outside, The snow continued to fall, covering Cedar Falls in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. But inside Thompson's Paint, surrounded by the tools and materials of my trade, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. Money, I was learning, was a powerful thing even before you had it. The promise of wealth was already changing everything, and I wasn't sure if it was changing me for the better or worse. The truth was, I'd spent so many years being the man Linda left that I'd forgotten how to be the man she might want back. And with millions of dollars waiting in my future, I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to trust anyone's love as genuine again. Winter turned to spring, and Linda began showing up at the shop regularly, always with some excuse. She'd bring coffee and donuts for the crew, help with small administrative tasks, and stay late to talk about our memories together. It was like watching someone try to rebuild a house from the foundation up, placing each brick of kindness and attention with careful precision. My employees noticed the change in atmosphere. Jimmy, who had never liked Linda even when we were married, would roll his eyes whenever her car pulled into the parking lot, but even he had to admit she seemed different, more humble, and less demanding than the woman who used to complain about the smell of paint on my clothes. "Maybe she really has changed," he said to me one afternoon, as we watched her organize receipts at the front counter. "People do sometimes, you know, learn from their mistakes." I wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that Linda's return was motivated by genuine love rather than circumstance, but the secret of the inheritance sat between us like a wall I couldn't see around. Every kindness she showed me, every gentle touch or understanding smile, was tainted by the question of whether she'd still be there if she knew the truth about my financial situation. The months crawled by with agonizing slowness. I found myself marking days off on a calendar like a prisoner counting down to freedom, but I wasn't sure what I was being freed from or into. The inheritance had become less about the money itself, and more about what it represented, the power to choose who I wanted to be and who I wanted to have in my life. In April, Linda and I had dinner together for the first time since she'd left. Nothing fancy, just pizza at Romano's, the same place we used to go when we were dating and couldn't afford anywhere expensive. She laughed at my jokes the way she used to, touched my hand across the table, and for a moment I almost forgot about the shadow hanging over us. "I've been thinking about us a lot," she said as we shared a piece of tiramisu, "about all the ways I failed as a wife. I was so focused on what we didn't have that I couldn't see what we did have." "Which was what?" I asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. "Security, not financial security but emotional security. You never made me doubt that you loved me, even when I was being impossible. Richard had money but he never made me feel safe the way you did." It was the most honest thing she'd said since coming back, and it hit me harder than I'd expected. Because that's exactly what I'd been trying to give her all those years: safety, stability, the promise that whatever else happened she'd always have me. "Then why did you leave?" The question came out before I could stop it. Linda set down her fork and was quiet for a long moment. "Because I was scared. Scared that safe and stable meant small and limited. Scared that if I settled for what we had, I'd wake up at 50 and realize I'd missed out on something bigger." "And did you find something bigger with Richard?" "I found something that looked bigger," she said sadly, "but it was all surface, like a movie set that looks impressive from the front, but has nothing behind it." We drove home separately that night, but she followed me to my house and sat with me on the porch swing I'd installed the summer after she left. We didn't talk much, just sat in comfortable silence and watched the stars come out over Cedar Falls. "I'd like to try again, Marcus," she said finally. "If you'll let me." I wanted to say yes. God help me, I wanted to say yes so badly it physically hurt. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was deceiving her as much as she'd once deceived me. She was falling in love with a struggling small business owner who was just getting by, not a millionaire in waiting. "I need more time," I told her, and watched her face fall. "How much more time?" she asked. I almost laughed at the irony. "4 more months. Ask me again in 4 months." She nodded, though I could tell she didn't understand the timeline. How could she? She had no way of knowing that in 4 months everything would change, and I'd finally have the answer to whether her love was real or just another investment strategy. May and June passed in a blur of long workdays and longer nights spent thinking about the future. The inheritance had stopped feeling like a gift and started feeling like a test, one that I wasn't sure I was passing. I found myself watching Linda constantly, looking for signs of calculation behind her affection, measuring every gesture against the possibility that she might leave again if circumstances changed. July brought the library renovation project, which Thompson's Paint won after a competitive bidding process. It was good work, honest work, and it kept my mind occupied during the final weeks of waiting. Linda helped with the administrative side of the project, and I had to admit she had a head for organization that my business had been lacking. "You know," Jimmy said one afternoon, as we took a break from scraping old paint off the library's exterior, "she's different than she used to be. More real, I guess." "You think so?" "Yeah, before she always seemed like she was performing, you know. Like she was playing the role of your wife instead of actually being your wife. Now she just seems like Linda." I hoped he was right. I desperately wanted him to be right. But with less than a month left until the inheritance became mine, the uncertainty was eating me alive. The call came on a Tuesday morning in August, exactly 12 months and one day after that first conversation with Margaret Shaw. I was at the shop early, reviewing invoices and trying to figure out how to stretch our cash flow for another week when my phone rang. "Mr. Thompson, this is Margaret Shaw. Congratulations, as of today, the inheritance is officially yours." The words should have filled me with elation, but instead I felt a strange calmness settle over me. "What do I need to do?" "Just come to Chicago and sign some papers. The funds will be transferred to whatever accounts you designate." "You're a wealthy man, Marcus." Wealthy. The word felt foreign in my mouth when I repeated it after hanging up. I looked around my small office, at the stack of bills and the calculator that never seemed to show numbers I liked, and realized that none of it mattered anymore. But what did matter? What was I going to do with $2 million? More importantly, what was I going to tell Linda? I drove to Chicago that afternoon, my hands trembling on the steering wheel as I navigated through downtown traffic. The same building that had intimidated me a year earlier now felt familiar, almost welcoming. Margaret Shaw greeted me with a warm smile and a firm handshake, leading me into her office where a stack of documents waited on the polished mahogany table. "You've done well, Marcus," she said as I signed paper after paper, each signature transferring incomprehensible amounts of money into accounts I'd never imagined owning. "Arthur would be proud. His private investigator kept tabs on you throughout the year, you know." My pen froze halfway through signing my name. "Private investigator." "Oh yes, Arthur was very thorough. He wanted to ensure you were handling the waiting period with integrity. The investigator reported that you maintained your business, continued working honest hours, never lived beyond your means, despite knowing what was coming. Most people would have started spending money they didn't yet have. The thought that I'd been watched for an entire year should have bothered me, but instead I felt oddly validated. Someone had been witnessing my struggles, my choices, my attempts to remain the man Uncle Arthur believed I could be. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. "Arthur left this for you to open after the inheritance was finalized." Inside was a letter written in the same shaky handwriting I remembered, but this one was longer, more detailed. I read it twice before the words fully sank in. "Marcus, if you're reading this, it means you've proven yourself worthy of not just the money, but the responsibility that comes with it. I've spent the last year watching you through reports, and I'm impressed by your character. You didn't change, didn't become someone else because of what was coming. That tells me everything I need to know about the man you are. The money is yours to use as you see fit, but I hope you'll remember that wealth is a tool, not a destination. Build something meaningful. Help people who need helping, and most importantly, trust your instincts about people. You have good judgment, Marcus. Don't let money cloud it." I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Margaret watched me with the patient expression of someone who'd seen this moment play out many times before. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Terrifying," I answered honestly, and she laughed. "That's the right response. The people who aren't scared of this much money are usually the ones who shouldn't have it." I drove back to Cedar Falls as a millionaire, but nothing looked different through the windshield. The same cornfields stretched to the horizon, the same small towns dotted the interstate, the same radio stations played the same songs. It wasn't until I pulled into the parking lot of Thompson's Paint that the reality began to hit me. Jimmy was still there, working late as usual, his truck the only vehicle in the lot besides mine. I found him in the back, cleaning brushes and organizing supplies for the next day's job. He looked up when I walked in, and something in my expression made him pause. "Boss, everything okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." I almost told him then, almost blurted out the whole story right then. In the supply room surrounded by paint cans and drop cloths, instead I just nodded and said, "Long day, you should head home to Maria and the kids." He studied my face for another moment, then shrugged and hung up his apron. "You sure you're okay?" "I'm sure. See you tomorrow." After he left, I sat alone in my office and stared at the phone. Linda's number was programmed in my contacts, had been for months even after the divorce. I could call her right now, tell her everything, watch her reaction. But Uncle Arthur's words echoed in my mind, "Trust your instincts about people." What were my instincts telling me about Linda's return? That was the question I'd been avoiding for months, the answer I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Instead of calling Linda, I called my bank and scheduled a meeting for the following morning. Then I went home to my small house on Maple Street, and sat on the porch swing, looking out at the neighborhood where I'd lived my entire adult life. Every house held memories: the Johnsons next door, who'd brought casseroles after Linda left; the Martinez family across the street, whose teenage son I'd taught to change oil in their driveway; old Mrs. Peterson, who always waved from her garden when I came home from work. These people knew me as Marcus Thompson, the painter. They'd seen me struggle, seen me get back up, seen me work 16-hour days to keep my business afloat. Would they still see me the same way when they found out I was worth more than all their houses combined? The next morning, I met with Charles Brennan, the president of First National Bank. Charlie and I had gone to high school together, though we'd run in different circles back then. He'd gone off to college and business school, while I'd learned my trade through apprenticeships and hard work. Now he sat across from me in his wood-paneled office, trying not to show his shock as I explained my new financial situation. "$2 million? He repeated, as if saying it out loud would help him process the number. $2 million? 100,000, I corrected. "I need to know what my options are." Charlie leaned back in his leather chair, adjusting his tie in the nervous gesture I remembered from high school. "Well, Marcus, this changes everything for you. Investment opportunities, real estate, business expansion. You could retire tomorrow if you wanted to." Retire, the word felt strange. I was 37 years old, in the prime of my working years, and suddenly I had the option to never work another day if I chose not to. But work had always been more than a paycheck for me. It was identity, purpose, a way of contributing something meaningful to the world. "I don't want to retire," I said. "But I do want to expand. I've been thinking about what this money could do for Thompson's Paint, for the community." We spent 2 hours going over possibilities. I could buy out my competition, open locations in neighboring towns, invest in new equipment that would make us the most advanced painting contractor in central Iowa. But as Charlie talked about market share and profit margins, I found myself thinking about something else entirely. "Charlie," I interrupted, "what would it take to start a scholarship fund?" He blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "A scholarship fund? For kids who want to learn trades, plumbing, electrical, carpentry, painting. Kids who might not be college material, but have good hands and strong backs." Charlie's expression softened. "That's a noble idea, Marcus. We could set up an endowment, create an application process, partner with the community college's vocational programs. How much would it take to make a real difference? To fund, say, 10 full scholarships per year, probably $500,000 as an initial investment, then ongoing contributions to maintain it. $500,000. A year ago, that number would have seemed impossible, fantastical. Now it was just a portion of what sat in various accounts with my name on them. "Let's do it," I said. Charlie stared at me for a long moment. "Marcus, are you sure? That's a significant commitment." "I'm sure." We shook hands on it, and I walked out of the bank feeling lighter than I had in months. For the first time since Margaret Shaw's phone call, the money felt like something positive instead of a burden I was carrying. But I still hadn't decided what to tell Linda. She was waiting for me when I got back to the shop, sitting in her car in the parking lot with the engine running. When she saw my truck, she got out and walked over, her expression concerned. "Jimmy said you left early yesterday, and seemed upset. Is everything okay?" I looked at her standing there in jeans and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, no makeup, no jewelry, except for the small silver earrings I'd given her for her birthday 3 years ago. She looked like the Linda I'd fallen in love with, not the woman who'd walked away with Richard Blackwood. "I'm fine," I said. Just had some business to take care of. What kind of business? The question was casual, but I caught the slight edge in her voice. The old Linda wouldn't have asked. She would have assumed that whatever business a small-town painter had to take care of couldn't be very important. Banking stuff, I said vaguely. She nodded and dropped the subject, but I noticed her glance at my truck as if looking for clues about where I'd been. It was a small thing, probably meaningless, but it stuck with me as we went inside and she helped me organize invoices for the library project. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into planning the scholarship fund. I met with administrators at the community college, visited trade schools in neighboring counties, and interviewed contractors who might be willing to provide apprenticeships for the scholarship recipients. The more I learned about the need for skilled tradespeople, the more excited I became about the project. You know, said Janet Morrison, the head of career counseling at Hawkeye Community College, as we toured their automotive repair facility, we lose a lot of potential students because they can't afford the tools and equipment. Even with financial aid, the upfront costs can be prohibitive. What if the scholarship covered everything? I asked. Tuition, books, tools, even a small living allowance. Janet's eyes widened. That would be incredible. We could reach students we've never been able to help before. I authorized the bank to begin setting up the Thompson Trade Scholarship Foundation that afternoon. The paperwork would take weeks to finalize, but knowing it was in motion gave me a sense of purpose I'd been missing. Linda noticed the change in my mood immediately. You seem different lately, she said one evening as we shared Chinese takeout at my kitchen table. Happier, more, I don't know, confident. I almost choked on my lomi. Do I? Yes, it's like you figured something out that you couldn't see before. She wasn't wrong. Having the financial security to pursue projects I believed in had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. For the first time in years I wasn't constantly worried about money, wasn't lying awake, calculating how to make payroll, or whether I could afford to fix the leaky roof. But Linda attributed my improved mood to her presence, and I let her. It felt dishonest, but I wasn't ready to reveal the truth. Not yet. Maybe it's because you're here, I said, and watched her face light up with genuine happiness. She reached across the table and took my hand. Marcus, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. I know I hurt you in ways that might never heal completely. But I want you to know that coming back to you was the best decision I've ever made. Her hand was warm in mine, familiar despite the months apart. I wanted to believe her. God, how I wanted to believe her. But Uncle Arthur's letter kept echoing in my head. Trust your instincts about people, Linda, I said carefully. If things were still the way they were when you left, if I was still struggling financially, would you still be here? She pulled her hand back. Her expression hurt. How can you ask me that? Because I need to know. Because the woman who left me said I'd never be worth anything. I need to understand what changed your mind. Tears gathered in her eyes, and for a moment she looked genuinely wounded by the question. What changed my mind was losing you. What changed my mind was realizing that Richard's money couldn't buy the things that actually matter. Love, loyalty, trust, security that comes from being with someone who would never hurt you the way I hurt you. It was a good answer, maybe even an honest one. But something in her tone, some slight calculation in the way she'd phrased it, kept me from being completely convinced. I need more time, I said again. This time she didn't ask how much more time. She just nodded and squeezed my hand before clearing the dishes from the table. That night, I called Margaret Shaw from my home office. The door closed so Linda wouldn't overhear. Marcus, she said warmly, how are you adjusting to your new circumstances? It's overwhelming, I admitted. I keep waiting for someone to tell me it's all a mistake. That's normal. Arthur went through the same thing when his business started making real money. He used to call me at all hours, convinced he was going to wake up back in his childhood bedroom, above his father's shoe repair. The image made me smile. Margaret, can I ask you something? Did Uncle Arthur ever mention anything about testing people's motives, about whether money changes how others see you? There was a pause on the other end of the line. He did, actually. Arthur never married because he could never be sure if women were interested in him or his bank account. It was one of his great regrets. He used to say that money was a gift and a curse. It gave you the power to help people. But it also made you question everyone's motives. How did he deal with that? By being very careful about who he trusted, and by remembering that actions matter more than words. People can say anything, Marcus, but their behavior tells you who they really are. After I hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about Linda's behavior since she'd returned. She'd been attentive, helpful, apologetic, but she'd also been calculating in small ways, asking about my business, noting improvements in the shop, questioning my mood changes. Were these the actions of a woman genuinely trying to rebuild a relationship, or someone positioning herself for something bigger? I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, but Uncle Arthur's advice and my own instincts were telling me to be cautious. The money had already changed how I saw the world. I couldn't let it blind me to people's true intentions. The Scholarship Foundation was officially established in October, with an announcement in the Cedar Falls Gazette that caused quite a stir in the small business community. The article mentioned that Thompson's Paint was funding the scholarships, though it didn't specify the amount or how I'd come by the money. Marcus Thompson, local painting contractor, has established a scholarship fund to provide full educational support for students entering trade programs, read Janet Morrison from the newspaper over breakfast at Murphy's Diner, where half the town seemed to gather for coffee and gossip every morning. Jimmy, who was sitting at the counter, turned to stare at me. "Boss, where the hell did you get scholarship money?" I'd been dreading this question for weeks. "I'd been saving," I said weakly. "Saving. Marcus, 3 months ago you were worried about making payroll, now you're funding scholarships." The entire diner had gone quiet, everyone waiting for my answer. Linda, who was sitting across from me, watched my face with an expression I couldn't quite read. "I got an inheritance," I said finally, "from my great-uncle in Chicago." It wasn't a lie, exactly, just an incomplete truth. But Jimmy's eyes narrowed. "How much of an inheritance?" "Enough to help some kids get an education they couldn't otherwise afford." That seemed to satisfy most of the diner's patrons, who went back to their coffee and conversations. But Linda's expression had changed. There was something sharper in her eyes now, a calculating look that made my stomach clench. "You never mentioned an inheritance," she said quietly as we walked back to the shop. It wasn't something I wanted to broadcast. "How much, Marcus?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating for months. The moment when I'd find out what Linda's return was really about. "Enough," I said. "Enough for what?" "Enough to expand the business. Enough to buy a bigger house. Enough to give me the life I wanted before." There it was. The truth finally out in the open. Not concern for my well-being, not curiosity about family I'd never mentioned. Just a calculation about what this inheritance meant for her. "Linda," I said carefully, "why does it matter?" She stopped walking and turned to face me, her expression wounded. "It matters because we're talking about getting back together. It matters because if we're going to rebuild our marriage, I need to know what our future looks like. And if the inheritance was just enough to cover the scholarship fund. If there wasn't anything left over." The pause before she answered told me everything I needed to know. It was barely a second, just a slight hesitation, but in that moment I saw her mind working, calculating, adjusting her strategy. "Then we'd make it work," she said finally. "We'd build something together, like we should have done before." But the damage was done. In that tiny pause Linda had revealed herself. Her return wasn't about love or regret, or missing what we'd had together. It was about positioning herself for whatever financial opportunities my inheritance might provide. I felt something die inside my chest, some last hope I'd been carrying that her feelings were genuine. Uncle Arthur had been right about money being a curse as well as a gift. It showed you who people really were, and sometimes that knowledge was more painful than ignorance. "I need to get back to work," I said, starting to walk again. Linda hurried to catch up. "Marcus, wait. Did I say something wrong?" "No," I said and meant it. She'd said exactly what I needed to hear to finally understand the truth. That afternoon, I called Margaret Shaw and asked her to recommend a private investigator. "Marcus, is everything all right? I need to know the truth about someone," I said. "About whether their feelings are genuine or if they're motivated by something else." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "This is about a romantic relationship, isn't it?" "My ex-wife." She came back after learning about the inheritance. "I need to know if I'm being paranoid or if my instincts are right." "Your instincts are probably right," Margaret said gently. "But I understand wanting proof. I'll give you the name of someone Arthur used occasionally. Discreet, thorough, ethical. The investigator's name was Daniel Cross, and he ran a one-man operation out of a modest office in downtown Cedar Rapids. When I met with him the following week, I was struck by how ordinary he looked. Average height, average build, the kind of face you'd forget 5 minutes after seeing it. Perfect for his line of work. "What exactly do you want to know about your ex-wife?" he asked, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. "Everything. Where she's been living, who she's been seeing, what her financial situation really is. I want to know if her reconciliation attempts are genuine or if there's an ulterior motive." Daniel nodded without judgment. "This kind of investigation usually takes 2 to 3 weeks. I'll need some basic information to get started, and my rate is $300 per day plus expenses." The cost would have been prohibitive 3 months ago. Now it was pocket change. I gave him Linda's full name, social security number, and last known addresses, then wrote him a check for $2,000 as a retainer. "I'll call you when I have something," he said. While Daniel Cross investigated my ex-wife's motives, I focused on building something positive with the money Uncle Arthur had left me. The scholarship foundation was just the beginning. I started looking into other ways to invest in the community, ways that would create lasting value rather than just generating more wealth for myself. Cedar Falls had always struggled with its downtown area. Half the storefronts on Main Street were empty, victims of big-box stores and online shopping. But I saw potential in those empty buildings, possibilities for something that could bring life back to the heart of the town. I met with Mayor Patricia Hendricks on a Tuesday morning in her cramped office above the courthouse. Patricia was a tough, no-nonsense woman who'd been fighting to revitalize downtown for years with limited resources and too much political opposition. "Marcus," she said, gesturing for me to sit in one of 2 folding chairs that served as her office furniture, "I heard about the scholarship fund. That's wonderful, really wonderful. This town needs more people willing to invest in its future." "That's actually why I'm here," I said. "I want to talk about downtown revitalization." Patricia's eyebrows rose. "I'm listening. What would it take to turn Main Street into something people actually want to visit? Not just a place to conduct business, but a destination." She pulled out a thick folder that looked like it had been handled many times. "I've got plans, Marcus. Lots of plans. Mixed-use development, green spaces, cultural attractions. The problem is money. Everything I want to do requires significant upfront investment, and the city budget isn't exactly robust." I studied the architectural drawings and cost estimates she spread across her desk. The vision was impressive. Restored historic buildings housing restaurants and shops on the ground floor with apartments above, a small park where the old Woolworths used to stand, pedestrian-friendly streetscaping with trees and benches. "How much?" I asked. "For the complete revitalization?" "We're talking $8 to $10 million over 5 years. I tried not to smile at her shocked expression when I didn't immediately balk at the number. "What if I told you I might be able to help with some of that?" Patricia leaned back in her chair studying my face. "Marcus, that's a lot of money. Thompson's Paint is doing well, but this kind of investment—" "I came into some money recently," I said, using the same incomplete truth I'd told at the diner. "An inheritance. I want to use it to make a difference in this community." "How much of an inheritance are we talking about?" "Enough to get started on your plans. Enough to prove that downtown Cedar Falls is worth saving." We spent the next 2 hours going over specific projects, identifying which buildings had the most potential, which improvements would have the biggest impact on foot traffic and business development. Patricia's excitement was infectious, and I found myself getting caught up in her vision of what Main Street could become. "We could start with the Riverside building," she said, pointing to a 3-story brick structure that had been empty for over a year. "It's got good bones, beautiful architecture. With the right renovation, it could anchor the whole revitalization effort." I made a note to have the building inspected and appraised. If the numbers made sense, Thompson's Paint would soon be in the real estate development business. But even as I planned ways to invest my inheritance in the community's future, I couldn't shake the feeling that my personal life was about to implode. Linda had been asking more questions about the inheritance, pushing for specifics I wasn't ready to give. Her behavior had become increasingly calculating, and I found myself watching her the way you'd watch a chess opponent, trying to anticipate her next move. The call from Daniel Cross came on a Thursday afternoon while I was reviewing renovation estimates for the Riverside building. I stepped into my office and closed the door before answering. "Mr. Thompson, I have the information you requested about Linda Thompson." "Can we meet?" How bad is it? I asked. Let's just say your instincts were correct. Can you be at my office tomorrow morning? I agreed to the meeting and hung up, my stomach churning with dread. Part of me had hoped I was wrong about Linda, that her return was motivated by genuine remorse and love, but a bigger part of me had known better, had recognized the signs of someone with an agenda. That evening Linda cooked dinner at my house, something she'd been doing more frequently as she tried to establish a sense of domestic normalcy between us. She made my favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, and opened a bottle of wine that was more expensive than anything we'd ever shared during our marriage. "This is nice," she said, raising her glass in a toast, "just the two of us like old times." I clinked my glass against hers, but the wine tasted bitter. Everything felt bitter now that I knew I was being manipulated. "Marcus," she said, cutting her meat with deliberate precision, "I've been thinking about our future, about what we want to build together." "What kind of future are you imagining?" "Well, with your inheritance we could really make something of ourselves, expand the business, maybe move to a bigger house. I saw that beautiful Victorian on Elm Street is for sale. Can you imagine us living there?" I could imagine it actually. I could afford it now, could afford to give Linda everything she'd ever wanted, but the knowledge that her affection was contingent on my bank balance made the fantasy feel hollow. "Linda," I said carefully, "what if the inheritance wasn't as much as you think it is? What if it was just enough for the scholarship fund and maybe a small business expansion?" I watched her face carefully as I spoke, looking for tells, for signs of disappointment or calculation. She did her best to look supportive, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes, the pause before she answered. "Then we'd make it work with what we have," she said. "We'd build something together, step by step," but her heart wasn't in the words, and we both knew it. The next morning, I sat across from Daniel Cross in his modest office and listened to him destroy what little hope I'd been harboring about Linda's motives. "Your ex-wife has been living in Des Moines with her sister Jennifer for the past 8 months, he began, consulting his notes. "She's been working part-time at a medical billing company, making barely enough to cover her share of expenses. She's been calling old friends, trying to borrow money, and has defaulted on 3 credit cards since her relationship with Richard Blackwood ended." I absorbed this information without surprise. I'd suspected Linda's financial situation was desperate. "More importantly," Daniel continued, "she's been asking questions about you for weeks before she showed up at your shop. She contacted Jimmy Rodriguez, your foreman, claiming she was concerned about your well-being but really fishing for information about your business. She's been to the courthouse researching property records to see if you'd bought anything expensive recently. She investigated me thoroughly. She also hired a different private investigator to look into your finances, though he didn't turn up much, since your inheritance was handled so discreetly. But the intent was clear. She wanted to know if you were worth pursuing." The betrayal cut deeper than I'd expected. It was one thing to suspect someone's motives. It was another to have proof of their deception laid out in black and white. "There's more," Daniel said gently. "She's been in contact with Richard Blackwood throughout this reconciliation attempt. Phone records show regular calls between them, including one as recently as yesterday." My chest tightened. "What kind of contact?" "Based on what I could determine, she's been keeping him informed about your situation. My sense is that they view your inheritance as a potential solution to both their financial problems." I leaned back in my chair feeling physically sick. Linda hadn't come back because she loved me or missed our marriage. She'd come back because she saw me as a mark, someone to be exploited for financial gain. "Mr. Thompson," Daniel said, "I know this is difficult to hear, but there's one more thing you should know." I braced myself for whatever revelation was coming next. "Your ex-wife has been telling people that you're worth millions. She's been bragging about your inheritance to her friends, claiming that she's going to get half of it when you remarry." The words hit me like physical blows. Not only had Linda been manipulating me, she'd been counting my money and spending it in her mind before we were even officially back together. I paid Daniel Cross his remaining fee and walked out of his office in a daze. The drive back to Cedar Falls passed in a blur of anger, hurt and bitter vindication. My instincts had been right all along. Uncle Arthur's warnings about money changing how people see you had been prophetic. But even knowing the truth about Linda's motives, I found myself reluctant to confront her immediately. Part of me wanted to see how far she'd go, how long she'd maintain the pretense of caring about me rather than my bank account. I decided to wait for her to make her move. It didn't take long. Linda made her move 2 weeks later on a Friday evening when Cedar Falls was settling into its weekend rhythm. She'd prepared my favorite dinner again, set candles on the table, and opened another expensive bottle of wine that I knew she couldn't afford on her part-time salary from Des Moines. "Marcus," she said, reaching across the table to take my hand, "I have something important to discuss with you." I kept my expression neutral, though my pulse quickened. "What's on your mind?" "I think it's time we made this official again. I mean really official." She smiled in a way that was supposed to look shy but came across as practiced. "I want us to remarry." There it was. The endgame I'd been expecting since Daniel Cross had laid out the evidence of her deception. I took a sip of wine to buy myself time, watching her face in the candlelight. "That's a big step, Linda. Are you sure you're ready for that kind of commitment?" "I've never been more sure of anything." Her grip on my hand tightened. "We could have such a wonderful life together, Marcus. With your inheritance we could travel, buy that house on Elm Street, maybe even start a family." The casual mention of the inheritance confirmed everything Daniel had discovered. This wasn't about love or second chances, this was about securing access to money she'd already spent in her imagination. "How much do you think I inherited, Linda?" She blinked, caught off guard by the direct question. I don't know exactly. Enough to make a difference in our lives." $2 million, I said quietly, watching her reaction. Her eyes widened, and for just a moment her careful mask slipped. I saw pure avarice flash across her features before she composed herself. "That's wonderful, Marcus. We could do so much good with that kind of money. Well yes, when we're married, what's yours is mine, right? That's how partnerships work." I pulled my hand free from hers and leaned back in my chair. "Linda, I know about Richard." The color drained from her face. "What about Richard?" "I know you've been in contact with him throughout this whole reconciliation. I know you investigated my finances before coming back. I know you've been telling people I'm worth millions, and that you plan to get half when we remarry." She opened her mouth to deny it, but I held up my hand to stop her. "I hired a private investigator. I have phone records, witness statements, documentation of everything. The question isn't whether you did these things. The question is why you thought I was stupid enough not to figure it out." Linda's carefully constructed facade crumbled completely, her shoulders sagged and tears began flowing down her cheeks. But even now, even caught red-handed, she tried to manipulate the situation. "Marcus, please let me explain. Yes, I made mistakes. Yes, I was desperate. But my feelings for you are real. The money doesn't matter compared to what we have together. If the money doesn't matter, then you won't mind signing a prenuptial agreement that leaves you with nothing, if our marriage fails again." She stared at me in shock. "A prenup? Marcus, that's not how marriages are supposed to work. Marriage is about trust, about sharing everything." "You're right. Marriage is about trust, which is why we'll never have one." I stood up from the table, and she grabbed my arm desperately. "Please don't do this. I love you, Marcus. I know I went about this wrong, but I love you." "No, Linda, you love my bank account. There's a difference." She broke down completely then, sobbing and pleading, promising to change, swearing that she'd never been motivated by money, but it was too late. The truth was out, and we both knew it. "I want you to leave," I said quietly. "Tonight. Don't come back to the shop. Don't call me. Don't contact any of my employees. We're done." Linda gathered her purse with shaking hands, her mascara streaked down her face. At the door she turned back one last time. "You'll regret this, Marcus. You'll realize what you're giving up." "I already know what I'm giving up," I replied. "A liar who sees me as a paycheck instead of a person." After she left, I sat alone at my kitchen table, surrounded by the remnants of her carefully orchestrated romantic evening. The candles had burned down to stubs, and the wine had gone warm in our abandoned glasses. I should have felt victorious, vindicated by the revelation of Linda's true motives. Instead I just felt tired. The money Uncle Arthur had left me was supposed to be a gift, a chance to build something meaningful, but it had also cost me the last illusions I'd harbored about human nature, the last hope that someone might love me for who I was rather than what I had. Over the next few months, I threw myself into community projects with single-minded determination. The Thompson Trade Scholarship Foundation awarded its first 10 scholarships in January, and I attended the ceremony at Hawkeye Community College to meet the recipients personally. They were good kids with calloused hands and determined eyes, kids who reminded me of myself at their age. The downtown revitalization project moved forward as well. I purchased the Riverside building and 3 adjacent properties, then hired local contractors to begin the renovation work. Thompson's Paint handled the exterior restoration, and I took pride in personally overseeing every detail of the process. By spring, Main Street was starting to show signs of new life. A coffee shop opened in one of the renovated storefronts, followed by a bookstore and a small restaurant that specialized in locally sourced ingredients. The changes were modest but significant, proof that strategic investment could make a real difference in a small community. Jimmy noticed the change in me during those months. "Boss," he said one afternoon as we touched up trim work on the coffee shop, "you seem different since Linda left. More focused, I guess. Like you figured something out." "Maybe I did," I replied, stepping back to admire our work. "What's that?" "That the best revenge against people who see you as nothing but a dollar sign is to use those dollars to help people who actually deserve help." The scholarship recipients were excelling in their programs, and several had already secured apprenticeships with local contractors. The downtown project was attracting new businesses and foot traffic. For the first time since Uncle Arthur's death, the money felt like a blessing rather than a burden. But the universe, it seemed, had one more test in store for me. Richard Blackwood appeared at Thompson's Paint on a Tuesday morning in May, driving a beat-up Honda that was a far cry from the luxury vehicles he'd once favored. He looked older, grayer, worn down by whatever legal troubles had followed the collapse of his business empire. "Marcus," he said, extending his hand as if we were old friends meeting for lunch. "I was hoping we could talk." I ignored the offered handshake. "About what?" "About Linda. About the future. About opportunities for mutual benefit." I almost laughed at his audacity. "Let me guess. You and Linda have cooked up some scheme that requires my money." Richard's smile faltered slightly. "You're a wealthy man now, Marcus. Wealthy men understand that money is a tool, not a trophy. Linda and I have a business proposition that could benefit all of us." "Which is?" "Real estate development. I still have connections, knowledge of the market, experience with large-scale projects. You have capital. Linda has motivation to make this work." I studied his face, noting the desperate edge beneath his practiced confidence. "And what exactly would Linda's role be in this business partnership?" "She'd be our liaison, handling client relations and project coordination. She's very good with people, you know." "I know exactly how good Linda is with people." "The answer is no." Richard's composure cracked. "Marcus, you're making a mistake. This town is small, limited. You could be thinking bigger, investing in projects that actually matter." "I am investing in projects that matter, just not with people who see me as a mark to be exploited." "You can't be serious about staying here playing small-town philanthropist when you could be building real wealth." "I'm serious about helping people who deserve help instead of funding con artists who see my inheritance as their retirement plan." Richard's mask dropped completely then, revealing the desperate, angry man underneath. "You're a fool, Marcus. Linda could have given you everything, made you part of something bigger than this pathetic little town. Instead, you're wasting millions on scholarship funds and downtown restoration projects that won't make you a dime." "You're right," I said. "They won't make me a dime. That's the point." He left without another word, and I never saw him again. Linda called once, a few weeks later, but I didn't answer. She left a voicemail apologizing, claiming she'd realized her mistakes, begging for one more chance. I deleted it without listening to the whole thing. 1 year after Richard's visit, the first class of Thompson Trade Scholarship recipients graduated from their programs. All 10 found employment immediately, with starting salaries that would allow them to support families and contribute to their communities. The downtown revitalization had attracted 12 new businesses and created 43 new jobs. I was reviewing the foundation's annual report when Jimmy knocked on my office door. "Boss, there's someone here to see you. Says her name is Sarah Mitchell." Sarah turned out to be a social worker from the county, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She'd heard about the scholarship program and wanted to discuss expanding it to include at-risk youth aging out of the foster system. "These kids have incredible potential," she explained, spreading case files across my desk, "but they age out of the system at 18, with no family support, no college funds, no safety net. A program like yours could change their entire trajectory." I studied the files, reading stories of teenagers who'd survived impossible circumstances and still managed to maintain hope for their futures. What would it take? Housing assistance, mentorship programs, expanded funding for trade certifications, maybe $200,000 per year to serve 15 to 20 kids. $200,000, less than I'd spent on the Riverside building renovation. "Let's do it." Sarah's eyes widened. "Just like that. Just like that." As she gathered her files, Sarah paused at the door. "Mr. Thompson, can I ask you something? What drives you to do this?" Most people with your resources are focused on growing their wealth, not giving it away. I thought about Uncle Arthur's letter, about Linda's betrayal, about the lessons I'd learned about money and human nature over the past 2 years. Someone once told me that money is a tool, not a destination. I'm just trying to use it to build something worthwhile. That evening I sat on my porch swing watching the sun set over Cedar Falls. The downtown lights were just coming on, illuminating the renovated storefronts and the people walking between them. In the distance, I could see the community college where tomorrow's scholarship recipients were preparing for careers that would anchor them to this place I loved. Linda had been right about one thing. I could have thought bigger, invested in flashier projects, built real wealth for myself. But sitting there in the gathering dusk, surrounded by the evidence of what strategic generosity could accomplish, I realized I'd built something more valuable than wealth. I'd built a legacy worth leaving behind. My phone buzzed with a text from Jimmy. "Boss, the newspaper wants to do a story about you. The headline is 'Local Man's Inheritance Transforms Community.' You interested?" I typed back, "Tell them Marcus Thompson was just a man who got lucky and decided to share the luck around. That's the only story worth telling." The scholarship recipients would graduate, find good jobs, and raise families in communities that valued their skills. The downtown businesses would thrive, creating opportunities for the next generation. And somewhere, maybe, Uncle Arthur was smiling at how his lonely fortune had been transformed into something that connected people instead of isolating them. Money had tested my character, revealed the true nature of people I thought I knew, and forced me to choose what kind of man I wanted to be. In the end, the choice had been easier than I'd expected. I chose to be someone worth more than the numbers in his bank account. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.